Welcome, everyone, to our partner webinar series. Today's session is Top 10 Security Features to Enable in Microsoft 365. I'm Heather Lehman, the Director of Member Engagement here at ARMA, and I will be your host and moderator for today's program. I'm excited to be joined by our experts from Netrix, Liam McCleary and David Metzger, and as we explore this topic. If you're not a current ARMA member, I highly encourage you to visit arma.org to learn more about our benefits and becoming a professional member. Your membership will give you access to our mentorship program, connecting with industry groups and chapters, and access to members-only webinars and education. And also be sure to join us for our next webinar on November 18th, and keep up to date on all of ARMA events by visiting our events calendar on arma.org. A few housekeeping items for today. If you have a question for our experts, please make sure to put that in the Q&A box. We'll send out the presentation and a link to view the session, so keep an eye on your email box. And I'd like to take a second to thank our wonderful people at Netrix. It's because of their support we are able to bring you additional programs and services. When considering products and services for your business, we hope you consider the partners like Netrix who support you. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Liam and David. Welcome.
Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here this morning. I'm David Metzger from Netrix. I'm a solutions engineer. I work with customers who are looking for security and compliance solutions to help them gain visibility into what's happening in their infrastructure, which includes Microsoft 365. But I'm not the subject matter expert on that process. That's going to be Liam, and I'll pass it over to him in just about a minute. But I also want to give you some housekeeping rules as well as a reminder that in addition to the recording that we'll send out and the slides, we've got about an hour worth of time. That's pretty much going to be all Liam and a lot of good stuff. Take notes where necessary, but also you'll have the slides to review because there's a lot of good stuff you want to not just hear about today, but remember down the road to implement it. And as far as Netrix, if we can help in any way, shape, or form, at the end of this presentation, I will give you a little bit more insight into how you can be put in contact with our resources. So for the agenda today, and before I pass it over to Liam, who's the star of the show, here's the basic agenda and outline. So how do you break down security into bite-sized chunks? He's done a great job of giving us these categories of core security category topics to then break down and see how you can understand how it works and do some demonstrations along the ways, logins and accounts, data flow devices, as you see on the list here. And then my job at the end is just to come in and wrap things up, how Netrix can come alongside you, because it's likely that if you have Microsoft 365, you probably have other services that you want to monitor as well. And so we're kind of a one-stop shop for that centralized monitoring. But there'll be question and answer at the end of this demonstration and this session. Liam will try to answer some of those questions that relate to his material along the way, but please enter questions that you might have on the top of your mind, and we'll get to them at the end, if not during the middle of the presentation. All right, so that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm going to pass it over to the one and only Liam Cleary, who's going to take us through this great session today. Sure.
Thank you, David. Okay, well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. My name's Liam. I'm going to be the one who's going to walk through this today. A bit of background for you. I live actually here in Virginia in the US. I'm from the UK. I moved out here. Oh, it's been about 11 years now. I don't sound like I'm from here, obviously, except I do use odd words that my parents tell me that I sound American. You know, we use the word trash instead of rubbish and things like that. So I have kids too. I have 4 kids, and 3 of those are from the UK, and 1 was born here. So I have an American anchor baby. So all good fun there. So my core focus on a day-to-day basis is Microsoft 365 security. That's where I spend all of my time. I perform security assessments, etc. as well. So I'm excited to speak to you about the top 10 controls that you should implement in a 365 tenant. Now, before we get to that, I suppose to set the stage for this, at the back of all of the assessments that I kind of done over the past few years, it's interesting to me how different each tenant is. So some organizations it's a very quick deployment. They want to go to SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and they just kind of go with it. And then security tends to be an afterthought, and maybe not even a thought apart from just allowing people to get in. But then on the other side, you have some organizations where they, they have to figure out the security first, and then it makes it really complicated, and people don't really want to use it because it's more complicated, and it doesn't quite work. So my goal is to hopefully show you at least some of the core controls that you can put in place. So to start with, I wanted to break down the security controls into 6 easy buckets. So when you're looking at the tenant, these are the 6 buckets that we're going to focus on. So the first bucket in Microsoft 365 security is clearly authentication and authorization. That's the knock on the door when someone tries to get in. So that's your username, your password, your set of credentials, whether it's an on-premises credential, your network credential that you log into your laptop each day is single signing all the way through, or whether it's some other mechanism that you're using. But that's our first category. And there are protections in place for authentication and authorization. The next one, which is separate from authentication and authorization, is actually access control. Often people put the two together, and that's not actually right, because authentication authorization is technically different to access control. So an example of that would be I have a login account to get to my tenant. I'm authorized by my license to get to a SharePoint Online, but my access control says I'm not allowed to access these 10 documents. So access control is a different category in its own right, and that spreads across each of the services within Microsoft 365. So SharePoint Online has access control, OneDrive for Business has, Exchange, Teams, and actually some of those access control components actually flow across all of them too. So Teams would be an example of that, where it's utilizing multiple services and components, and the access control flows from the top all the way through. Then, of course, you've got data and content. Everyone likes to look after their content. Nobody wants to share it with anybody. It might be your IP as an organization. It might just be a sales quote. It could be, the pictures from the Christmas party. It could be any kind of data and content that you've stored within SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business or even Teams. You want to have some kind of security capabilities, and luckily there is. Then, of course, we've got devices that will come in. So we kind of live in the always connected anywhere connection type world at the moment, especially as we've all been working at home for so long. Mobile devices becomes critical. So we do need to protect, I have my iPhone here, is my iPhone compromised? Is it up to date? Is it the latest version? Does it have the right security controls? If my phone got stolen, would any work material be visible to anybody that tried to get on the phone? So we need to protect that connection that's coming in. And then, of course, Microsoft's big pitch is about sharing. The idea of using 365 is collaboration, sharing with internal users, external users, sharing with the world. I mean, SharePoint has the word share in front of it for a reason, because it's about collaboration. But we also need to restrict that. Are we going to allow your end users to share with anyone, or does it have to be controlled? And then we have what's called the perimeter, which is a separate category. And I'm talking the perimeter edge. So imagine I've got like a ball in my hands here. You should be able to see me on the video, but that perimeter edge goes around the outside of the 365 tenant that's yours. And then everything you access is inside that circle. And so the perimeter edge is going to be utilizing something called a CASB, so a cloud application security broker, which is going to look at the requests that come in and out and make decisions based on that. Now, 6 categories is great, but I wanted to break this down a little bit further into 3. So I came up with the security building blocks. And in our security building blocks, our first category is logins and accounts. So what I wanted to talk about here was what is encompassed in logins and accounts. So think of our 6 categories. So authentication, authorization, access control, etc. This could be narrowed down to logins and accounts. And in the logins and accounts, Microsoft 365 provides multi-factor authentication, interactive user sign-out, account lockout, password expiration, and banned passwords. So these are 5 specific features that are available within every Microsoft 365 tenant that can be enabled for any user that's coming in and accessing the site, even external users. So for example, an external user that's not part of your organization could in fact have to pass a multi-factor authentication. And the other options are available for accounts that you create in the tenant. So our first category is logins and accounts, and those are the 5 things that we can look at for implementation. Our next category is data flow. Data flow encompasses that data and content, and it covers certain things such as app consent, it covers mail forwarding rules, and external sharing. App consent is the ability for an end user or an admin to consent an application to gain access to their information. So for example, let's say you're in Outlook, you're utilizing Exchange Online, you decide to add an app into your Outlook ribbon bar. That ribbon bar app will need some kind of consent from the tenant, and you will effectively grant it access on your behalf to do things. It can also be maliciously used, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Mail forwarding rules is quite a common one. You want to forward mail from your corporate account to a personal account or forward it to something else. It's actually one of the most common vectors. So when 365 tenants have been compromised, one of the first things that attackers do is create mail forwarding rules. And I'll talk about an experience with that a little bit later as well. And then external sharing. Internal sharing can be bundled into that too, but our big worry is external sharing. So our second category of the 3 is data flow. And then our third category is the devices, which encompasses 2 different things. The first one on the right, which is mobile application management, really focuses on the devices themselves. So how do we protect the content? You know, do we need to encrypt the content? If the phone gets stolen or they lose it, can we wipe the contents that's corporate on that phone, or can we do something with it? And then legacy authentication on the other side of it is about the connections that come into the tenant. So legacy authentication is basically any authentication that doesn't support what Microsoft term as modern authentication, which is multi-factor authentication or some type of second factor. Legacy authentication was one of the most abused protocols over the past couple of years in attacks within Microsoft 365. So that's our 3 blocks. So take the 6, now with the 6 down to 3, we get logins and accounts, we get devices, and of course we get our data flow. So what we're going to do is talk through each of the categories. So we'll talk about logins and accounts. And the purpose of this is to review the risk that is actually available, or if we don't implement something, and then what's the protection that we get with that. And then we'll kind of talk through and demonstrate some of those too. So our first one is multi-factor authentication. Now, I'm sure you all know what multi-factor is. It's a second factor. It's something that you can then say and confirm that that's you. Because I always tell people, so often because I do assessments in 365, organizations will create accounts for me in their tenant. So they'll go into Azure Active Directory, they'll say, create new account, say, Liam, at company, blah, 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 and give me the credentials. But how do they know that it's actually me that's logging in? How does your organization know that it's you that's logging in? It's only a set of credentials. It's not looking at your face and recording you as you log in. It's just an authentication request. So when we talk about, multi-factor authentication, it's that second layer that only you should know. It could be a text message that you get. It could be a token that you have to put in. It could be a card that you have to swipe if you're like military. It could be a CAT card. It could be a certificate. It could be a key, a USB key that you put in. It could even be the Windows Hello and using your face recognition. Different options for that second factor. But what's the risk though by not doing it? I find so many organizations that have not implemented second factor authentication of any kind, because often it takes a change in the users. And for example, as an IT person, I often know what my end users are like. So I worked, for example, with a local council, and they wanted to implement multi-factor authentication, but half of the council employees didn't have phones. They had desk phones in the office, but they didn't have cell phones. And it was predominantly because of the age of their employees. They didn't seem to have them, or they did, but they weren't smartphones. They were just cool, old school flip phones or whatever. And so the difficulty was they were trying to implement something modern against a user base that really wasn't ready for that. And so they haven't been able to enable multi-factor authentication yet, because they can't do that. So you will know your users, but what's the risk of not doing it? I mean, nearly every data and security breach involves a compromised account of some description, a set of credentials or a hacked set of credentials. If it's compromised, then that account can be used for further attacks on the organization. And of course, what we often find is that, let's say Sue or John in accounting, let's say, they might use their same network password for other services too. So that means that, John logs into his corporate email with, password 1, and then he logs into his, Comcast email with password 1 and logs into his bank with password 1. And it's actually quite a common issue that we kind of see of people reusing passwords. So even if they did reuse passwords, second factor would at least help that. So what does Microsoft offer? Well, the protection that's in there will protect every account authentication attempt, and it will force validation to that second factor. Now, of course, it's not going to prompt every 30 seconds. It's all about configuration, but you can actually enforce that second factor based on various conditions also. The easiest and simplest approach is to install some kind of authenticator app on the mobile devices, on the phones. Now, of course, that's based on your user base. And you can obviously implement this using conditional logic. So, for example, you might not want to force multi-factor for every single person that comes into the office, opens their corporate laptop. So you already have some identification of who they are and where they are. You may not want to force multi-factor. But if they happen to be at home, logging in with their corporate machine, you may want to add that in. Or if they drive to a Starbucks and decide to do work from Starbucks, then you definitely want to put multi-factor on there and force them to kind of add that in. So multi-factor is definitely one of the primary authentication and protection mechanisms that should be enabled in every Microsoft 365 tenant. Now, the second one is signing out inactive users. Now, 90% of tenants that I ever go in here don't have this enabled. And it's okay. It's not the end of the world. However, the risks for this are kind of long-term, and they've been around for a long, long time. So it goes back to this idea. So I'm sure you've all stayed in hotels. So I travel a lot with my family and we stay in hotels. I never use the computers that the hotels offer, but if you go into a hotel, they often have business center and you can go and use the computer, and they're built as kiosks. So the idea is that you can just log in, and then when you come out, it clears everything out. Sometimes in organizations, kiosks are kind of built that way also. But of course, what happens if a user logs in and then stays logged in, or they kind of like it just comes out, a user can come right behind them and that session is still valid. I'm sure you've seen this where you've logged into your browser as one account and then you think you signed out, and then when you go back, it auto signs you back in again. It's really frustrating, but it's by design that browsers do that. So often attackers can reopen the browser and obviously go back in again. And then, of course, an attacker can access the user ID and then be able to re-authenticate, like without actually being prompted for the password because they're already authenticated. I get that issue all the time in different sessions in my browsers, and I open a browser and when I go to the next browser, it's opened as the same user. I'm like, oh, but that can be a security risk. So the protection that's provided is really around protection for SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. It doesn't really affect anything else, but what it does is we can actually go in and say, I would like to sign users out of Microsoft 365 after a period of inactivity. It's not the old school way of doing it, whereas if you just shake the mouse, it stays longer like a screensaver. What it does, it looks at end user requests. So if you have a browser open and the request was made and then no subsequent requests have been made, it can then sign you out. So it's not like you have to shake the browser to wake it up. It's not how that works. But it means that you can protect the account with multi-factor to make sure that somebody has to pass a second factor, which ultimately means that this may not be an issue. But if you have users that don't have that and they share machines, then of course, at least you're signing them out correctly after a period of inactivity. And so the account will sign out across all of the services for that account in Microsoft 365. So it's definitely one thing to add and layer over the top. Our next one is account lockout. Now, I'm sure we all love this one, and I'm sure we've all experienced being locked out. You put the password in wrong. I've done it multiple times. I normally do it on demonstrations, like I'm doing a presentation or I'm building a training course or something, and people are watching me, and then I really can't type anything. My fingers don't work, and it just locks everything out. But what's the risk here? So the risk is without account lockout, then of course an account just continues. So the idea is here that as an attacker, I can brute force an account. I can perform what's called a dictionary attack or a password spray attack. So the idea is that I take a big long list of passwords and usernames, or maybe I know the username from my information gathering, and I basically spray passwords at Microsoft 365 until it gives in and finds one that works. And that's a common attack. A common attack is that the password gets guessed, because if I was to take my email address and put it and do some scans across the internet, maybe jump in the dark web and have a look, you'll probably find that my email address has been visible in multiple compromises because my personal email is connected to LinkedIn or something else, and they've been known to be breached. And so there's long lists of password hashes and usernames, etc. So account lockout allows us to kind of control that. So what are the protections? So Azure Active Directory has what's called a smart lockout. So the smart lockout uses intelligence in the cloud to distinguish between you and a malicious version of you. So if you're logging in proactively and just working as normal, and then behind you, somebody comes in and guesses your password and tries to come in there, it will be smart enough to recognize that actually that's not you. And it can lock that out, but leave you to continue working. Now, the smart lockout has 10 as the default option for failed logins and sign-ins. So after 10, it will then lock out for a certain amount of time, and then it will start to incrementally kind of change. So I'm just going to answer a question at the same time because you're talking about passwords. So does Microsoft 365 support use of passphrases? Yes, it does. There's no limitation on what you would like to use as a password. If you're predominantly on premises with Active Directory, then your passwords will be synchronized up to the cloud. So it will be whatever you use on the network. If you're in the cloud predominantly with no on-premises, then yes, you can use password phrases, you can use GUIDs, you can use simple, whatever you want to do, it's entirely up to you. There's full support for that. Now, the smart lockout locks the account from sign attempts for 1 minute after every 10 failed attempts. So you can imagine if I am scripting the process, trying to authenticate, boom, 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 10, I get a 1 minute timeout. Then it'll do 10 more attempts. And then you would think that it would just be a 1 minute one. But actually what happens, it starts to extend that time. So it may be a minute the first time, it could be 2 minutes the next time, it could be 3 minutes and 4 minutes and 10 minutes, etc. It will continue to kind of grow that timeout so nobody can guess. So working as a security tester ever so often, one of the things that you can do is try and guess what the timeout is. So you lock an account out and you kind of keep trying it every few minutes. Then you go, oh, it was 10 minutes. And so you put a 10-minute wait time and then you run each password to try and bypass it. But what's clever about this is you're not able to do that. Smart Lockout also tracks the last 3 bad password hashes. So if I keep trying it, it'll hash the password, store it, so that it's checking for valid. It's not just reissuing that same password. And the good news is you all get this. And with the default settings, it's just on. It's just there. So this is a standard feature. Now, the values that you can update are found within the Azure Active Directory portal. And we have a custom smart lockout section where you can set the threshold, which is the number of times the password can be bad, and then the duration in seconds. And that's the starting duration, and then it will grow from that point. Okay, so the next one is the biggest question of all. Should we set passwords to expire? Now, you can read articles online. You could have debates about whether we should expire passwords. It's really entirely up to you, but this is the risk of expiring passwords, is that you know your end users. And for example, like the question we just answered about passphrases, they may not be into using passphrases yet. They may be into using a password, and users will tend to pick weaker passwords. And then they'll kind of slightly change it when it's time for reset. The amount of times it's like, you know, something 1, 2, 3, 4, something 6, 7, 8, 9, something, you know, and then they're trying to do funny characters on the keyboard. They'll be like, let's do QWERTY, or we can do QAZWSX, or it can be POL. And they do patterns on the keyboard to just use the same password with appending something at the end. So because users tend to reuse existing passwords, and hopefully we've got better at this now, then malicious attackers can simply guess what that would be. So the protections, so first off, Microsoft follows NIST, so National Institute of Standards and Technology. They recommend disabling password expiration. There's no actual valid reason to expire passwords unless, so I work for organizations ever so often, they will create me an account and maybe it's going to be valid for a piece of work for 60 days. Then they will expire the password in 60 days. That makes sense. But a regular account, there's no reason to keep resetting the password. If you've got an account with a password and second factor authentication, then there's no reason to do password expiration every 180 days or every 60 days or 90 days. What you should do is, if the account is compromised and confirmed, then you force a password reset at that point. So that should be the only reason that you're trying to expire a specific password. Now, password expiration can be done utilizing PowerShell. So the first off, we can use what's called get Azure AD user, and we can pass in the user itself using PowerShell. And then we can select a property called, password never expires, and you check the password policy for disable password expiration. So we can basically run this instead of using get Azure AD user with the object ID. We can literally just type get Azure AD user and the rest of it, and it will iterate every single account and then let me know whether or not they have password expiration. If I want to set the password to never expire for all the users, I can use that get Azure AD user PowerShell command again. This time I'm using -all. That's going to get me every single account. And then I'm just going to say set Azure AD user password policies, disable password expiration. So fairly straightforward. So we have the ability to disable password expiration at the Azure Active Directory function. We can also do it inside the admin center as well. We can go into some of the org settings and make changes there too. But this is definitely one that's up for contention. Many security teams and many IT teams want to expire passwords. It's a big thing to kind of move away from, to not expire passwords. Because in the old days, in the old school way of working, I remember years and years ago, like 20 years ago, I might not look that age, but 20 years ago, when I was working in the IT support team, we relied on the password expiration policies to force people to not use silly passwords. But now we don't have to. We've moved along a long way, and there's other technology available to us. So our next one is a banned password list. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could just stop users using specific things? Maybe we know what the passwords are. Maybe we have a list of the top. Okay. So if you go online into your favorite search engine and, Bing, Google, whatever, and type top 1,000 passwords and then have a look at them. Just have a look at them. I still don't know how password 1234 is near the top, how password 123 is at the top. And then you can read the other ones, bizarre passwords, just random words, soccer team names, football team names, food, really simplistic things are still the top passwords. So what's the risk then with passwords? Well, we talked about this already. End users might reuse passwords. It's also common and it's easy to discover passwords. I can go online. For example, one of the largest password files that was available used to be the LinkedIn one. So when LinkedIn was breached, there's like X million passwords in there that are plain text. And so you can use that as a file for doing attacks against something. And of course, when accounts use either common or simple passwords, the odds are fairly high that they might get breached or at least be attacked because there's no complexity. So it goes back to the question that I answered, passphrases work better. So what protections? Well, Azure Active Directory includes a global banned password list by default. You don't have to worry about that. Microsoft handle that one. It means all of the common passwords that have appeared in breaches, Microsoft handles that. So if you try to reset an Azure AD account to some of those, it will notify you or it will even block you from actually setting the password to there. The custom banned one is available to you as an organization. Now you can add up to 1,000 words. These should not be passwords unless you found that multiple people are using that specific thing for a password. They should be words that relate to your organization. So if you were an organization that made car parts, for example, You may want to put, the name, the brands of car, Ford, Chevrolet, Peugeot, whatever, like you put them in, or it may be like exhaust or bonnet or hood or boot or door or, certain words that you just don't want to see inside a password. Because if I was an attacker, that's the first thing I do is try and think of words. You have to kind of think like an attacker, think like a hacker, the hacker with I should put my hood up. I've got a hoodie on today. I should put my hood up like a hacker and just think of like, if I was trying to guess a password and you worked for an organization that made cars, I'm going to try and guess words that relate to that because I'm pretty sure you might pick something like that. Now, to set the banned password list, we can go into Azure Active Directory and then notice where the custom smart lockout piece is. We actually have a custom banned password list section at the bottom, and we can obviously add those in. Okay, so let's have a quick look at doing some of these. I'm just going to move to my browser for a second. Okay, so I'm in my Microsoft 365 tenant, and I'm just going to change my tab here to go to Azure Active Directory. So I'm in my Contoso tenant, just a vanilla tenant like everybody else is. I'm going to click on Azure Active Directory here. And in my Azure Active Directory tenant, I can scroll down to the security option here. And inside my security option, you'll see I have a whole host of different things. The first thing I've got here is authentication methods, which allows me to determine the types of authentication methods that are available. But what I'm interested in here is password protection. So when I go to password protection, you can see that this is out of the box capabilities. So there's my 10, my value, which is the lockout threshold. If you ever want to know what they are, you can see that. So how many failed sign-ins are allowed. And then I've got my lockout duration, which is the increased time to be able to go backwards and forwards. Underneath that is my enforce the custom list, where I can start to add passwords. So I'm not suggesting you do this, but as you can see, we can just start typing words on each line, and they become values that if somebody tries to reset their password, then if I typed password 1234, it's going to block me and say, no, you can't use that. Now, we'll just pause for a second. If you are using Active Directory on premises for your network, then the odds are pretty high that these won't make any difference to you, because your password protections will be on premises in your Active Directory. So whatever the group policy, permissions, restrictions are there will be what happens when you press Control or Delete. However, if this piece at the bottom here, which is password protection for Windows Server, is enabled and enforced, and you've installed the agent on the servers at the bottom, like in your network, then these will count. So you can join the two together. So you can start to utilize banned password and custom banned passwords lists in your on-premises network as well by installing the agents. So obviously it's not going to be enabled by default, but I can add 1,000 of these. So these should be words that are specific to your organization. Now, if I go back to Active Directory here and I can go into my users here, you'll notice that in the top here, we have what's called per user MFA. So per user MFA, it's going to have to authenticate me, is the standard way that you can enable multi-factor for individual users. So for example, if I wanted to enable multi-factor for Adele and Alex and Alan, I can select their accounts and I can then say enable and choose enable multi-factor auth at this point. The next time the users log in, then what's going to happen is they're going to end up with having to go through an enrollment process. So they'll be prompted to add their phone number, their email address. They'll get a token sent to them in a text maybe, or maybe the authentication app. And then at that point, the next time they log in, it will be that process they will have to go through. Now, that's one way of doing it. The other way is to go back into Azure Active Directory here, go back to my security option, and then you'll see we have what's called conditional access. Conditional access is our condition-based controls. So actually from here, I could say new policy. Let's just call it MFA. I'm going to go into here and say all users. It is going to complain about doing this. So I'm actually just going to say select users. Let me come into here, select users, and I'm going to do users, and I'll just pick my Apu from The Simpsons. So this one's going to be just for Apu. It could be a group, it could be multiple users. So I'm going to set that. I'm then going to go in and choose my application. So I'm going to say whenever Apu tries to connect to all of the cloud applications, I can then set some conditions, but I'm not going to, but I'm going to go to access controls and say require multi-factor authentication. And I will then select that. I can then turn that on, click create. And the next time Apu logs into my tenant, tries to get to anything in the cloud, he will have to go through a registration process and then perform multi-factor every single time. So a couple of simple ways of kind of creating rules and policies to kind of restrict things and to assist in controlling the accounts. Now, of course, from a SharePoint perspective, remember we talked about the controls there. If I go into access control, you'll see that we have idle session sign out, and you can see by default, this is a default tenant. It's not enabled. I can say on, and then I can choose when to sign the users out. Pretty sure 5 minutes and 15 minutes and 30 minutes are a little bit too much. And so we can obviously go into like 4 hours, and then I'm going to give the user 15 minutes before they sign out. And once I save that, at that point, it will then start to kind of control and sign them out if they don't continue down the route of using the application. It's just a protection barrier to add. So a few different things that we can kind of go through here. Now, of course, from a security perspective, if I go back here, you can see I can click on multi-factor, and I've got lots of kind of settings available to us here. This is more controlling if I had multi-factor server installed. But if I wanted to go through and configure some of the protections around the accounts, so utilizing what's called multi-factor registration, then I can create a multi-factor registration policy that will basically say every user that ever comes in the tenant will have to go through and start registering multi-factor registration and start to use that process. So it's a fairly simple process to go through. We can just go in and configure it, and it's done. Okay, so that was a quick whistle tour there. So let's move on to data flow. So from a data flow perspective, we're talking about consenting to those applications. Remember the scenario here. So let me give you a real world. I did a webinar with a friend of mine who's a Microsoft employee out in Europe, and we wanted to show what the problem was for this. So I'm going to put the risks up here, and then I'll kind of talk through. And what we did is we created a Microsoft Teams app. So we custom built one using SharePoint Framework, and we put it into a Microsoft team. And any end user that went to that Microsoft team, they would see our little custom app, they could click onto it, and then it would do stuff. Now, what we did, which was clever, is we designed it in a way where if you were an end user, it would give you an error message. There was nothing wrong with it. It would just present you with an error message. If you were an administrator, it would work. Now, think that through for a second. Why would I want to do something like that with an application? So what we did is we said, hey, Mr. End User, Mrs. End User, go ahead and access the app. They clicked on it and it said, there was an error with the application. Please contact your administrator. So what would happen is they would log a ticket. And of course, the administrator would say, well, I don't have that app. So he would have to add the app into the team that he was in so he could see it. So he would add the team. And of course, as an admin, he would get a consent box, just like the end user. And in the consent box, it would say, these are the permissions that you consent to. So he would go in and say, accept, and add it in. And at that point, it would go in and display something. And the admin would say, it works perfect for me. And the end user would say, well, it doesn't work. Unbeknown to the administrator, we were now copying files that the administrator had created and owned. We were copying emails out of Exchange Online and copying them somewhere else. We were streaming data that the administrator had access to using the Microsoft Graph and moving it away. That consent is really powerful because you're consenting an application to do something on behalf of you. If you happen to be an administrator, then I get everything that you have access to. So the protection that's available here is Azure Active Directory provides two kind of mitigations for this one. You can basically block, excuse me, end user consent, or you can enable administrator consent workflow. Now, the options that are available to us is the most important one. We can disable user consent. So end users cannot grant permissions to any applications. Very rarely do I see that because honestly, most of the help desk team don't want to have 1,000 phone calls and help desk tickets. So they just allow it to kind of work. And if they want to add it, then so be it. The other option is users can consent to apps, but they have to be kind of verified publisher and registered in the tenant. So for example, the default ones will be the Microsoft ones. So these ones users can consent. So if the user wants to add Planner into the Microsoft team or into SharePoint or into Outlook, for example, they can do that. And then of course, you've got the users can consent to all applications, which is the default, which every single tenant is configured that way. So that means I can go in and say, oh, I want to add that one. I want to add it, and it prompts up. I say accept, and off we go. And if it happens to be a malicious app, then it does what it's going to do. If it's one that's not, then it works as expected. So we have some controls available to us. Now we can utilize PowerShell to kind of control this again. Now I'm going to premise this, I always do, because I think this is the most bizarre PowerShell property name ever, and they couldn't have made it longer if they'd have tried. Permission grant policy IDs assigned to default user role. The devs that wrote that, I have no idea. So when you blank that property out, it will disable the user consent. If I want to allow, for example, Microsoft consent, then I populate it with the string value. Now, if you don't want to use PowerShell, then of course we can configure using Azure Active Directory. And you get these options available to us, where we can simply say, do not allow, allow, or allow user consent for apps. So it's a simple kind of check option that you can go through in Azure Active Directory. Now, of course, if you want to consent to unmanaged applications, this is a little bit different. So when we talk about unmanaged and things like that, some of this will be to do with things like email forwarding rules that can be utilized within those unmanaged applications. You often find that applications will be connecting into the graph and creating forwarding rules. So I got called in to work on a Microsoft 365 breach, a health organization out here in DC. They'd had an attack. Actually, they hadn't had an attack. It was their vendor had had an attack. The vendor had been compromised. The vendor had a set of credentials that were given to them from the health organization so they could manage some of the stuff in 365. They had stored a digital copy of the credentials. The attackers had come into that company, found the credentials, then logged into this tenant, not the same one, but the health organization, and then managed to get into that account, then started sending emails to users in the organization who the vendor had been communicating with, but they were phishing emails crafted in a very specific way. What they did is they created a login page that looked just like the Office 365 login page. And so when a user got a link, it would say, oh, hey, I am, vendor A, let's say. It's like, I got an email from vendor A. He sent me the proposal or the document. Click the link. It would show the login page. They would put their credentials in. Then it would error. And then it would redirect to the actual login page. So you got to think the logic through there. Now, what they also did is created forwarding rules inside email. So for that email box, any email that came back, so if an end user was like, hey, why are you sending me emails? They never got there. They just got forwarded out to this hacker team that were obviously doing the attacks. So you got to think the logic through. When a user was clicking the link, putting credentials in, they were stealing the credentials, redirected into the login page, and they were getting stuck in this weird error. But the attackers were gaining credentials, and then they were logging into that mailbox and repeating the same process. So if we think of the logic a little bit here, if we have applications or we've created forwarding rules, I should have named that title a little bit different. But if we had those forwarding rules in mailboxes, then we need to remove those. We need to block the creation of forwarding rules because we've seen applications creating those because you gave it permission when you granted consent to the application. You need to ensure the content isn't leaving the organization. And this, just by blocking those forwarding rules, will mitigate that common attack vector. So the options available to us for blocking client forwarding rules is we can go into the remote domains in Exchange and we can say, disable to allow automatic forwarding. So the remote domains will be whatever you're trying to send it out to. We can use role-based access control as well. So we can basically say only this role can forward and send messages outside. And then, of course, we can use the standard old school way of doing it, which is transport rules. So you can implement if logic. So basically you'll say, if if the sender is located in the organization, so if it's my account in the organization, and if the recipient is outside the organization, so if it's going somewhere outside and it's got a message type of auto forward, then reject it and don't let it go anywhere. So we have the ability to control that flow in the domains and stop messages leaving. When we built the app in Microsoft Teams, it's one of the things that we did. We created client forwarding rules automatically, and then we streamed email out, and any future emails were also forwarded out to a mailbox, and we picked them up and saved them. It's not complicated to build something that can be quite malicious. So talking about the external piece, for example, not just with email, what's the risk here? Now, we all know the risk. This is the most common risk. So PII data being shared externally, something could be shared externally that it shouldn't do. Something could be sent to, other accounts like Gmail and Hotmail, something that's not a business email. You could lose your, company secrets, your IP. It could be anything. The risk is that data is leaving the organization and it wasn't allowed to in the first place, or you didn't want it to, but somehow people found a way of doing it. So I'll give you an example. Years and years ago, when I was back in the UK, I actually worked for a few interesting places, but one of the ones I worked for was Scotland Yard and also serious organized crime. And when I worked in serious organized crime, I was in a new unit that was in a bunker underneath a nondescript building in London, and it was called CEOP. It was called the Child Exploitation Online Protection Center. That's where I worked, and I was part of the infrastructure team that was building everything that they were trying to utilize. And they were on a restricted network, clearly, because of the sensitivity of what they were doing, but they needed to share information with a police force out in Scotland, and also Interpol and FBI and CIA and a few other bits and pieces. But there was no actual way of communicating. And so back then, they would have 3 computers on their desk, and they were all in different classifications of networks. And to make sure that they couldn't copy anything, the IT team had got a hot glue gun and glued all the ports. So you couldn't put like a USB stick in, or you couldn't put a network cable. Like the network cable was glued into the back of the PC and everything else was blocked. So they were very restrictive, but some smart person figured out a way that they could access what is now known as OneDrive, which wasn't back then. It was called Groove. And they figured out that that hadn't been blocked by anything. And so they started streaming really sensitive data out into the Groove network, and then having the other police forces pick it up from there. Let's just say that didn't end well and it got blocked very quickly, but people will always find a way of trying to get information out. So what are the protections that Microsoft 365 offers? Well, we can restrict sharing to specific users or groups. We can control where the content can be externally or internally shared from. We can also configure the type of sharing, and we can restrict the sharing settings. We also have the ability of putting classifications on things like sites to restrict that external sharing. Now, external sharing is configured in a hierarchy. So it starts at the tenant itself, then the admin centers, then site collections, and then sites within SharePoint. So sharing utilizes that hierarchy, but you can break it at the lower levels. So let's quickly drop over to SharePoint. So in my sharing capabilities here, a default tenant looks like this. So SharePoint allows anyone to share to anybody, and OneDrive does too. And I can go further down, new and existing guests. That means external guests that already exist in Azure AD, or, I want to share with Liam at Comcast, for example. I can do existing guests only, or I could turn off external sharing and say it's only internal. Now, most organizations will probably want to sit somewhere around here. Very rarely do they do anyone. But what we can do is we can limit by external sharing. So we can say add domains and block, and maybe you don't want to allow Gmail or Facebook, .com or something else. Maybe you want to block specific domains and say you can't share with those domains. On the flip side, we could also allow domains if we wanted to control it that way. We can also say allow users to share in a specific security group. So I could say Maybe I only want to allow my engineering team to be the ones that can share. That means nobody else can share now apart from that group. I can also go in and say, this one should be checked, by the way. So guests, when they get the invitation, they should only be connecting with the account that you emailed it to, not forwarding it to a different email and trying to get in that way. We should also uncheck allow guests to share items that they don't own. And then these options here, this is a great one. We can expire access automatically. So we have some capabilities that we can utilize. Now, once we set that, so I'm going to press save. I can, however, go into my list of site collections here. So if I click on this one and go to my policies, for example, for external sharing, you'll see that this one is set to only people in the organization. It's not configured where this one is. So at a site collection level, we can actually adjust that. So we can have it open more at the top, and then we can restrict at the site collections as we need to. And that's the same for OneDrive and also for the SharePoint sites. Okay, so let's talk about our devices. So two specific things here: blocking legacy authentication. Legacy authentication is protocols like POP, SMTP, IMAP, MAPI, etc. Microsoft numbers, they said that 99% of all password spray attacks against Azure AD over the past 18 months were against the legacy authentication protocols. So what's the protection here? Well, when you block the legacy authentication, you remove that surface area of attack. You then force modern authentication across all of those workloads, and then it blocks all of the older entry points that shouldn't be utilized in the first place. Excuse me. And this is done via conditional access policies. The last one here is mobile application management policies. This is me coming in from my phone, connecting into whatever it would be. What's the risk here? Well, we all got sent home during the beginning of the pandemic, and we were all told to just go and work. And I'm sure some of us connected our email to our work phone or our iPad, excuse me, and we were using potentially a insecure device. So that's the risk, is that, the risk would be, as an example, I could sync all of my OneDrive files from the cloud into a device locally and then give that device to somebody else and hand it off. So we need to protect from that. So what we have is independent kind of policies that we can apply to devices. Now, mobile application management, or MAM, is not the same as mobile device management, or MDM. MDM means that as an organization, you bought the devices, you own the devices, and you give them to your employees. MAM is bring your own device. That means you didn't buy the device. That means Liam bought his own phone and wants to get his work email on it, which I do. I want to get my work email on there. I want to get some other email on there. So I have to agree to specific policies. This is protection at the app level. So for example, I'm going to say if anything, for example, tries to get corporate email into, the iOS mail app, I'm going to deny that. So if I try to add my Office 365 account, it's not going to be allowed. But if I use the Outlook app, then that's going to be allowed because I've controlled and chosen that that's the app that I want to utilize. And then we can put protections around that. So let's go and have a quick look at that. So I'm going to go into Endpoint Manager and click on Apps here. And then I'm going to click on App Protection Policies. So I'm going to say Create Policy, and I'm going to say iOS and iPad. So it's going to be for my phone. I'm just going to put a name. We'll call it Test Policy. Choose Next. And then I'm going to choose the types of apps. So I'm going to say I want to select an app. And you can see I get this big list. So let's use Adobe Reader, AIP. Let's see if we can find Word. And let's see if we can find Outlook. Okay, so I'm going to apply protection to these 4 applications. There can be any number of applications. I'm going to choose Next. Now I get to start controlling what happens with those apps. So I can say, I don't want to back up any of that data into iTunes. And I don't want to just allow those applications to send information to any other applications. It has to be utilizing the policy managed apps. Only those 4 can communicate to each other. Maybe I want to control cut, copy, and paste. So for example, I can't copy a text message and paste it into Outlook. It won't work. I have to do something different. I can block it that way. I can then go through and say, well, I would like to encrypt, excuse me, all the organization's data. And I want to, have some control of where the data is going. I can then tell it that it needs to put a PIN in or use biometrics when you open the app, not just the phone. You'll have your own on the phone, but when I open the app, it's going to say, oh, you need to put a PIN in order for that to work. So choose next. I get some standard values, making sure the phone's not jailbroken or rooted. I can go through and then assign that to a specific group. So I can go in and say, let's use my engineering team and next, and then I can create that policy. That will be a MAM policy that goes in and protects the mobile devices. Now, on the other side of that, if we were doing a policy for legacy authentication, we're going to go back to conditional access policy here. From here, we can say new policy. I'm going to call it legacy blocking. I'm going to say users and groups. I'm going to select my user again. I don't want to block myself out in a demo. So we'll use Apu. And then in my conditions, you can see I've got client apps. And then if I say yes, if I uncheck the modern ones, you'll see this legacy authentication clients option. You make sure those are checked, go to the grant option, and then I can say block access. And at that point, anything that tries to connect to those legacy protocols will then get blocked. Obviously, click on and then create. Okay, so that was a quick whirlwind tour there. So from me, a couple of takeaways. The first thing to remember is that with any security configuration, they're only as good as the attacks that you currently know. New attacks are surfacing often daily, so you need to be up to speed on those. Microsoft 365 provides multiple login capabilities and reporting as needed. And then make sure that you monitor. It's essential to continually monitor and review the logs to identify things that need to be tweaked, further things to implement, etc. So I'll now turn over to David, who's going to talk about how Networks can help.
All righty. Thank you so much, Liam. A lot of good stuff, as usual. So let me just wrap things up here. I know we have a couple minutes. I want to respect everyone's time. And you will get the recording, and you can pause, and you can take notes, and each one of those modules could be its own course. So thank you so much for that great information. I'm going to just wrap things up from a networks perspective. Just a lot of you don't know about what we do as a company, but we provide solutions that would help you gain visibility into your entire infrastructure, including the things that were talked about today with Microsoft 365. So if you want to audit activity, who's being added as a privileged user to your global admin group, or who's logging on from unauthorized locations, those kinds of things we can pick up with the Active Directory and Office 365 modules. But you can see here on the slide, there's a lot of other things we can bring into a centralized database to run reports, have alerts for things that are happening on your file server and on your network devices, things like that. So I would recommend after this session to also go to our website and find out some of the things we have to offer in terms of solutions you might be looking for. And we have recently merged with StealthBits and have a lot more tools at our disposal. So if you go to networks.com, there's a way to do an online demo of our products so you can see for yourself, or do a scheduled one-on-one session with one of our engineers and download a free trial, even if you're interested. So that's my takeaway from Networks. Go to our website and see how we can help you bring all these things together. But now the question and answer section, we have a couple minutes. We can go over for those of you that want to stick around. But Heather, do you want to take it from here? And
sure. Yes, we've got a few questions that are in our queue here. So those of you that stick around will be able to see live. And if you do have to leave, we will send out the recording. You can catch all of our information later. So Liam, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to take a look at the box. Do you want to start looking at these questions?
Yes, yeah. I was actually just going to start writing for the last one, and I was working back the opposite way. So the question was really related to Microsoft Intune, so the endpoint manager piece that we just talked about. So how does this differ from an organization that requires a user to have Intune company portal on the phone? So the Intune company portal app goes hand in hand with a MAM policy. So most organizations will install or require the Intune company portal app to register the devices into the Microsoft 365 tenant. They don't always use it to do anything else. It just at least registers them into Azure Active Directory and Endpoint Manager. But you can also enforce the MAM policies via that Intune piece as well. So MAM policies only get enforced on devices when they have company portal registration in. Conditional access policies can obviously protect the mobile devices, but they won't do anything to the device itself. So I suppose they kind of go hand in hand, both of those.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a few more here too. There was one that was asked early on, and Tim is asking, does M365 support use of passphrases rather than just passwords?
Yep. So anything can be used: passphrases, passwords, long numbers, short numbers, whatever you want to do, whatever you can type in that text box is entirely up to you. And you can obviously control it that way. Obviously, most organizations will control that on premises instead of in the cloud. But if you wanted to, you have support for that too.
Wonderful. And Alicia is asking, can you apply additional security methods, for example, password protection, multi-factor registration, on specific locations in OneDrive or in SharePoint?
No, so not right now. That was one thing that was talked about on some of the roadmap meetings a while back, that they wanted to be able to implement extra levels of security controls in various locations. But right now, anything that's I suppose an account protection, so password, multi-factor, things like that, it's across the board. There's no way of saying, well, don't do it here, but do it here. If you enforce multi-factor, it's across the board.
And our last question here is, how do you customize what type of MFA you want them to register for?
Okay, so that's configured with inside Azure Active Directory. So when we went in and configured, went in and said like enable multi-factor as a conditional access policy, in the section where it talked about some of the server configuration, the ability for you to say, well, you need to provide questions, or it needs to be a text or a authenticator app or something else, or a phone call, they're all available within Azure Active Directory. And you can just literally check them on and off and check how many of them you need, or whether it's just one or two or multiple.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liam. That covers all the questions that we've got in our question answer area. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to Netrix, and thank you to Liam for being here today. And thank you, David. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And we will see you in our next partner webinar series.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.